I'm going to talk to you about the context in which we want to set our opposition to this debate. I'm going to give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points of rebuttal from the opening speaker. I'm going to talk to you about 3 of the 5 points of our case. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about human dignity and why we think this policy abhors it, erodes it, and removes the ability of people to mourn their dead in a way which doesn't deface them and their families. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about the concept of good reporting and why we think this actively harms this better news we think the first proposition would like you to have. And thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about the validation and propagation of pure evil and why you think this is what's going to be encouraged under this proposition. Because you think as much as they might like to say this is purely about Iraq and Afghanistan, reporting on civil wars in Africa we think is also involved in this debate. The concept of wanting to slaughter more to get more praise we think is a horrific thing to encourage and something which you're going to have to account for on your side of the house. Firstly, in relation to that very point, he said it's going to help eliminate violent and unnecessary wars. I mean, at the point where there is a market for news reporting in things such as civil wars elsewhere, the concept that this can be made visually available to millions and millions of people is only an encouragement to people to carry out more atrocities at the point where they can garner support or even just inflict horror on thousands upon thousands of people. Secondly, he said we should be able to show those soldiers, as Steve said, being hung, drawn and quartered. I would ask you a question, sir. What gives you the right to remove my family's ability to mourn my dead? We don't allow you to report on suicide. We don't allow you to report the faces of murdered and raped women in the street just because it might heighten people's ability to abhor rape. I mean, these are things that you protect people from purely on this basis. Thirdly, his case is mutually contradictory. Firstly, it will cause people to reconsider wars in which they are involved, but also people will not be able to comprehend the information in a rational fashion in order to make proper decisions. Rushal will talk more about screwing up domestic politics in relation to this policy, but the point is that they can't comprehend it properly, they can't come to a proper decision about whether or not the war is something they want to be involved in. Fourthly, we want people to be able to share the pain. Again, we need a justification as to why my pain or my family's pain is A, quantifiable by you, and even if you can quantify it, why you can squash it for the purpose of what you see as valid. And fifthly, he told us this will help us in relation to discretion, help us in relation to what's going on. And the quote from the opening speaker was, it's fine, we can tell the military what to do. If you really want to screw up the ability of the military to propagate wars in a strategic fashion which limits civilian casualties, allowing their movements to be hamstrung by the whims of a public, we think is something which is horrifically harmful and one which is bound to screw up more lives than it saves. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about human dignity, concept of good reporting, and the third thing, evil. And Roshal's going to talk to you about domestic politics and why sourcing this information is going to be specifically harmful. Firstly, the concept of human dignity. We think, in relation to from the victim's perspective, the government has a mandate to protect both the victim's memory, the victim's humanity, and the fact that at the point where you erode the humanity of a victim, you erode the humanity of every other person in existence. Their humanity is not bound up in themselves. The fact that we abhor it is the fact that we recognise they are human. We want to be protected from the fact that erodes that ability. Secondly, in relation to the gratuity in media reporting, we think not all news outlets are as altruistic and fantastic as first proposition might like you to believe. We think some of them will drive for the most gratuitous images, some of them will drive for ones which I'll take you in a moment, lead them towards the most horrific reporting purely for the point of media sales, as opposed to propagating some fantastic notion of information in relation to people's. We think at the point where horrific images is what sells newspapers, or horrific images is what drives up news, we think that's the thing which is going to be reported at the expense of proper information and at the expense of proper reporting.
Given that there are such strong international norms against atrocities, so strong indeed that often we intervene to prevent them, I don't understand why increasing publicity of them would ever make people more likely to engage in them.
Okay, what we are saying is, if you want to show a mass slaughter of people, which is what you were allowed to do on this side in relation to an African civil war, we would say, firstly, the people who are being slaughtered in that, you have a duty in relation to their humanity to protect them from being, like, basically watched by the world at the point where they meet their horrific end. And two, you have a duty to protect your people, as Rashad will talk about later on, from basically being passed on and watch that mutilation take place. Because we think at the point where the government prevents missiles from hitting your country during a war, because that hurts you physically, I think they should also prevent the mental anguish which war can bring upon you by the same behest. No thank you. We also think at the point where people see more of this day in, day out, it becomes more difficult for them to ever comprehend when something horrific happens. At the point where they are so used to seeing every corpse, every body, every burning piece of flesh, the next time something horrific happens which you want to garner extra support behind, it is that much more difficult because they are now so used to it that they cannot comprehend. Secondly, moving on to the purposes of good reporting. The point is, you can never properly get across the horror of war to a 100% degree, regardless of what you show people. The point here is relevance by exclusion. You can get across the point that something is horrific, no thank you, by pointing at certain images and certain facts and leading people to think, this is what they're reporting. Obviously there's some stuff they can't show me. God, must it be awful. What aren't they showing me? The point is, when they can see every single facile aspect of it, there is no spectrum or scope as to what they cannot see. There is nothing left to the imagination, which makes them think it might be even worse than that. I mean, the point is, you always want people to think war is a little bit worse than they see, at the point where you want them to have their conscience in check. At the point where you put it all on the table, that disappears because they're like, okay, well it's horrible, but now I'm seeing all of it. And worse again, if they decide that they're not abhorred by what they see, you are validating the concept of the government using tactics which might soil civilians, if civilians see it and aren't abhorred by it. I think that's also a risk you don't specifically want to run. No thank you. And finally, the concept of validation of pure evil. If someone's idea of how to propagate a war is the erosion of human life, the erosion of human dignity, you placing that on a grander stage gives a validation to that person's actions to a degree. Two, it encourages them to do even more horrific things at the point where they can gain glorification for their cause. They might know they're horrifically going to lose the war, but they don't care if they can show the horror of the destruction of a people, whether it be like any specific national group which has tried to be eradicated previously. I mean, they don't really care if they win the war, they just want to destroy another people. At the point where they can destroy another people and get it on CNN, I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing we still want to do, and CNN will be forced to report it at the point where I've already told you there are certain media aspects who will always cover it, so now you're guaranteeing the market solved. I think the point is they will actually have to fix this. And finally, the concept of the idea of the propagation of horror. This allows you, as a horrible Civil War maniac or whoever you might be, to propagate your horror and propagate your destruction onto the minds of unwilling participants. It allows you to not just slaughter that person with a burning stick in that country, but burn that image into the mind's eye of every single person who does it. That is something which those people may never be able to get rid of, and if someone said they were going to do that to you in domestic society, the government would have no problem stepping in and preventing it. We don't see just because it's on CNN that you give them the right to do so. So what have we told you? We've told you why specifically human dignity is eroded under this model. We've told you why the concepts of good reporting are actively harmed when the point of the story is lost and it's more about the burning flesh. And thirdly, in relation to the validation of pure evil, this is not something which either the media should be involved in or the government should be allowing to happen. We are very proud from the London School of Economics and from Ireland to oppose.